Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our discussion forum today. Today we're going to be discussing emergency and disaster planning, and we're very pleased to have three guest presenters today. So we've got Dean Phillips from the University of Cape Town from Bolus Herbarium, Christina Curry from Buse Herbarium at UKZN, and Mashiani Matagani from Sanby's National Herbarium in Pretoria. So thank you and welcome to them. And then, as usual, we have our NSCF hub people. We've got Chanel Ribeiro, who's the project manager, and Fulu Tambani, who's the science communication officer. And then there's me, Michelle Hamer, who's the NSCF project lead. So welcome, and I hope that you'll find today's discussions beneficial and interesting. Right, let's move on. So as usual, this is a discussion forum, so we welcome comments and discussion. But try and keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host and other participants. So to start off with, say hello in the chat box, let us know which institution you're from. And as we're going through the presentations, you're welcome to add questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. Actually, I only see the chat box maybe. Oh, and of course, Audrey and Darbo is also part of the NSCF hub team. I see she's just greeted. So add your welcome, your greeting in the chat box. And we're going to have quite a lot of time for discussion today. But even as we go through the presentations and questions, that you can keep posting comments and discussion points. All right. Next slide. So before we get started, I'm going to just hand over to Chanel. She's going to give us some instructions. Chanel.
Morning, everyone. So as we did at the last discussion forum that we had on risk, we'd like you to change your name in Zoom. It's just to help us to allocate people to groups. So we need to put you in groups according to the type of collection that you work in. So if you can relabel yourself with your first name, followed by one of the collection that you work in, be it herbarium, dry collections, wet collections, skins and bones, or fossils. And let me just go to the next slide just to show you how to do that again. So on your Zoom screen, you'll find a button that says participants. It will be at the top or at the bottom. Just look for that. Then you click on that participants button and you scroll to your name. Hover your mouse over your name and you'll see a more button pop up, and click on that, and then you can click on rename and then rename it to, for example, Chanel Dry Collections, and press OK, and then you'll be renamed. If everyone can please do that now. If anyone is struggling, just unmute yourself and I'll try and explain again.
Okay, so what's the purpose of the discussion forum today? I think it's an ideal opportunity to learn from other institutions' experience of disasters and plans. And it's an opportunity to ask questions about the emergency or disaster response plan. And then also just to discuss and learn about what others do, what others have in their plans, or how they think they'll handle a disaster or an emergency. And this is all to sort of go into institutions' disaster and emergency response plans. So we learn a lot from other people. Some people have enormous experience and we can learn from them. Right, next slide. So the program today, we're going to have our 3 guest presenters, Mashiani, Dean, and Christina. Then we're going to have a recap of the key points to include in an emergency or disaster response plan. Then we're going to have a group discussion about what actions should you take once a disaster has happened in the collection. And then we'll come back and have plenary discussion. And then we'll have a final question and answer session. So if anyone's got any discussion points or questions that have come up. All right, so we anticipate it'll be about a 2-hour session today. Next slide. So just to remind you, we've covered this in the webinar last week, as well as in the risk management topics. So for risks, you can avoid them, you can block them, you can detect them. And when you detect that there is a very urgent risk, then you'll have to respond quickly to stop it. And that involves planning, preparation, and effective actions to control that emergency. If you can't control the emergency, then you're going to have damage and you're going to go into the last stage, which is recover. So you have to recover from the damage and losses once everything else has failed. So we're looking at those last 2 blocks today. Right, next slide. So just a reminder again about the difference between emergencies and disasters. So an emergency is when there's an unanticipated threatening event that requires immediate reaction, immediate action. And a disaster is once that emergency gets out of control. So usually a disaster is a large-scale calamity that requires immediate action. So it often results in significant loss and damage or destruction. And there's man-made disasters and there are natural disasters. Right, next slide. So I think it's just important to get this clear now, and then we'll move on to the presentation. So an example of an emergency and a disaster and the different types of planning that needs to be in place. So for example, if there's a fire, it's detected somewhere in the building, in one room, or it's outside the building, that is now an emergency. And you can control that fire to prevent it spreading through the building. So you need, in your emergency planning, what would the plan of action be to control that fire? But if that fire gets out of control, it becomes a disaster. And that's where everyone evacuates. So you're not all going to run away from the building when there's just a fire detected outside. There may be an evacuation, but there'll be some people who will do something. But once that fire is out of control, people will be evacuated and you'll leave it to the professionals to put the fire out. And if it reaches the collections, it's likely to damage the collection objects, or the fire suppression system could also cause damage. So now the plan of action is to take action, like once the fire has been suppressed and it's safe to go back into the collection room, then what? Then you need a different kind of a plan once the disaster has happened. Okay, next slide. So I think at this point, we're going to hand over to Mashiani, and he'll tell us about a disaster that happened at the National Herbarium. All right, so over to you, Mashiani.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning to the colleagues out there. Let's start by saying this disaster actually happened over 10 years ago. At the National Herbarium in Pretoria. But just to give you a quick background, as you can see on the first slide, that I've shown the picture of the National Herbarium building, which is one of the oldest building, not necessarily the oldest building on campus. This building was erected in the 1960s, and it was officially opened for occupation on the 2nd of July, 1973. So it's quite old. The building in itself houses the National Herbarium collections and other divisions of SAMBI. But in terms of collections, the number of specimens that are housed in this building is over 1 million specimens, of which some of these specimens that are housed in here are have been collected over 100 years ago, which makes them of historical importance collections. Now, what happened? The next slide. Now, we are in the rainy season, which is summer now in October. In 2010, on the 28th of October, in the afternoon, we received a heavy rain in Pretoria, which actually became a storm overnight. And the roof of the eastern side of the building, as you can see on the top photo, was blown over into the parking lot. And that portion of the building had no roof at all. And quite luckily enough, when it happened, it wasn't during the working hours, it was at night. So there was no staff around in that time except the securities and the others who were working as standbys. So there were no injuries, except that the building was actually, the roof was actually destroyed. But should it have happened during the day, as you can see on the other photo where you can see the stairs, we could have actually been talking a different story in terms of injuries and other things, because the roof was blown over the parking lot. Now, the next slide, please. So as the roof was blown off, it continued to rain overnight, but the water, for it to come through the collection inside the building, it had to come through what we call an expansion joint. It was actually coming as a leak through. Luckily, the building had another layer on top of the roof was actually sitting on a slab, so the water could only come in through drips through the expansion joint. And as you can see on the pictures, especially the top one, you can see the water still actually collected on top of the cabinets there, and also dripping down to the lower cabinets also, and also some boxes you can see, and books and paper that was actually been put on top of the cabinets, also getting wet. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, in the morning of the 29th, of which is when these photographs that I'm showing you were actually taken, when we arrived at work, we had to immediately attend to this emergency, if you would call it, in this state, because we could find that the roof was blown off and the water was actually already inside the herbarium. Now, the rescue operation began, and we tried to rescue the specimens, take them out, and then try to dry them out, and put some buckets actually through, because the water was still actually dripping through. And quite luckily enough, we had enough manpower in the day, and as they say, we managed actually to rescue the collection of the affected area. And I must say to you that there was no serious damage that happened to the collection. So we managed to actually to rescue all the specimens. The next slide, please. Now, before even we get into the lesson learned, I must also indicate that while we were busy with the rescue operations, luckily at the time, the discussions around how to replace the roof and the clearing of the wreckage was also going on, and the wreckage was cleared, and the roof, the construction company was brought into site to start reconstructing within a month, and the building was restored. But in overall, if one look at this incident, I think there are many lessons to be learned from this. One of them that comes into mind is that natural disasters cannot be avoided, actually, but they can be mitigated with proper disaster response. And not only that, and as I've indicated earlier on, that the building is very old, so meaning that regular maintenance must happen. Should it have happened that regular maintenance was done on this building, especially, as I said, the water came through the expansion joint. You remember, expansion joint is part of the structure of the building. It actually plays many roles. One of them is actually to allow the building to move so that it actually doesn't break, because we are built on top of a hill here. So as the ash moves and shakes, so the building can actually have a flexibility to move. But also, again, the expansion joint, of course, in case wherein you are happens to the building perhaps to be bombed or earthquakes and things like that, the expansion joint actually minimizes that. But unfortunately, this expansion joint was not sealed properly over the years, and then so that's why the water could come through. So should it have happened that the expansion joint was sealed, fully sealed, it wouldn't have actually had water anyway coming into the collections. But the next other lesson that I think is also important, especially for most of us who works in the herbarium in the collections, and I don't think this is PRI alone. I think many other facilities where there are collections, sometimes is the case, that you find boxes and boxes of books and specimens all over, kind of a disorganized kind of situation. Disasters like this teaches us that now, if you have your collections kept in cabinets and well organized, so you wouldn't have specimens actually getting wet in such cases, because if they were in cabinets, they would have not actually got wet. And the next thing that was actually also great at the time is that our procurement systems were actually functioning quite very well. As I said to you earlier on, that to my memory, the construction started immediately after they've cleared the wreckages, which actually happened within a month. So there wasn't really a major disturbance. There was so the SCM system were actually working quite very well at that time. But the other important thing that I think we should also learn from disasters like this is that the workforce that you have in the building, they need to be safety conscious all the time, and so that they can actually report anything that they, for example, if an expansion joint it has got cracks and holes, it's not sealed. So if somebody had reported it, it would have been taken care of quite very early. But also most importantly is that in dealing with this disaster, we as the staff here actually pulled together, and actually the collection was rescued. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Mashiane. All right, thank you for that. And we're now going to move on to Dean Phillips, who's going to talk to us about the UCT fire. So over to you, Dean.
Thanks, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the recent fire on Table Mountain earlier in this year, and just giving an overview of what happened, specifically how UCT and the Bolus Herbarium were affected, and what we learned from this experience. So first, just a brief overview. It started as a wildfire near the Rhodes Memorial on Devil's Peak in Table Mountain National Park on the morning of Sunday, the 18th of April, 2021. And on that day, it was very hot, there was low humidity, and the conditions were very windy. And as a result, this fire spread rapidly towards the city and to the university campus. And the fire spread across campus mostly by spotting, where embers are carried by the wind, cross roads, and igniting trees and buildings. And ultimately, there was extensive damage to the Rhodes Memorial, including the restaurant, which was destroyed, the Mostard's Mill, which was the oldest functioning windmill still in the country, and then damage across various parts of the UCT upper campus. So in terms of the damage to UCT, most of the press coverage covered what happened to the library, where there was extensive damage, and the main reading room of the Jager Library was completely destroyed. There was also damage to student residences, 2 administrative buildings, and as well as the H.W. Pearson building. So these 2 pictures on the right are of the library, and the top right is the inside of the main reading room. And then the picture on the bottom left is the H.W. Pearson building. And I'm going to focus on what happened to the H.W. Pearson building, because this is the main biological sciences building that was affected. So the H.W. Pearson building is part of biological sciences. It was the building that was previously the botany department, and it houses the Bolus Herbarium and the Bolus Herbarium Library, as well as several research institutes, including the Plant Conservation Unit, the IC Wild, which is the Institute for Communities and Wildlife in Africa, the Seaweed Research Unit, and then various other facilities. So this picture on the bottom right, again, is of the PCU burning, Plant Conservation Unit. I don't have a good aerial view photograph of the whole building, but I just wanted to include this just to give you guys an idea of where the different fires were and where the bolus is in relation to the Plant Conservation Unit. So initially, when the fire had started in the PCU, and then later on in the day, we learned that the IC Wild was burning. Initially, I had thought, and many people had thought, that the fire had spread all the way across the top floor of the building. But actually, there were 2 separate fires that started independently. So this picture was taken first earlier in the day when the Plant Conservation Unit was burning. And that's on the one wing of the building. On the complete opposite end of the building is the IC Wild and the Bolus Herbarium. So the PCU and the IC Wild are both on the top floor of the building, and the bolus is directly below the IC Wild. So these are just some pictures of damage to the H.W. Pearson building. And this is a picture of the Plant Conservation Unit, which was obviously completely destroyed, as well as the top of the elevator shaft next to it, which was also destroyed. And the elevator is no longer functional as well. And then, like I said, I don't have a proper aerial view of any of the damage to the IC Wild, but the IC Wild and the bolus are basically just to the right of where this picture is cut off. And then inside, this is the staircase leading down from the Plant Conservation Unit, and the passage that it leads down to is the same passage that leads to the Bolus Herbarium Library, which in this picture on the far right, this is the Bolus Herbarium Library door. So the passage in front of the library door was flooded, but there wasn't extensive flooding within the Bolus Herbarium Library itself. Okay, and then moving on to the other side of the building, this is the IC Wild section, which is directly above the Bolus Herbarium. So on the top left, this is just a picture of the damage inside the main room of the IC Wild that was destroyed. There are 2 wings adjoining this room with offices that were also burnt, but they weren't completely destroyed like this. And if you look below that window there, yeah, that's the window, same window in the top picture. And then obviously the Bolus Herbarium Library directly below it. And then these 2 pictures on the right, this is taken the day after the fire. And this is the main door leading into the IC Wild, which is directly next to the Bolus Herbarium, which you can't see in this frame, but I'll show you a bit later. And then if you were to go through this door and turn right immediately, this is the staircase leading up to the burnt IC Wild. And this is where the water gushed down the next day and eventually flooded the herbarium. So how was the Bolus Herbarium directly affected? The main thing was that because of the burnt IC Wild directly above, this water coming down the staircase flooded the herbarium, which in some cases was about 2 centimeters deep, which on it's not obviously that deep, but because many of our cabinets are still wooden, they soaked up this water. And also there were quite a lot of specimens stored on the floor level. These are mostly loans in boxes. And one of the professors in an adjacent office also had probably hundreds of these specimens stored in boxes on the floor of his office. So these obviously needed to be rescued from the flooding of the following day. And then there was also some damage to the floor and ceiling. And because of the damage to the roof of the RC Wild, there was risk of additional flooding in the days following the fire. So these are just the same two pictures that I showed earlier. I just wanted to include a picture of the front of the Bolus Herbarium and the front of the RC Wild, just to show how close it was. And on this picture, second from the right, all of this black sludge sitting on the floor, that's directly in front of the front of the herbarium. And yeah, the firefighters had to cut through the RC Wild door to get in there to put the fire out. And then, so most of the floor of the RC Wild above the herbarium was concrete, but only in the section directly above it. Immediately once you step outside of the herbarium, some of the roof above and the ceiling is wood and the ceiling panels. So a lot of this also got damaged. Most of this damage was due to water afterwards, but there was a section where it was burned completely through the ceiling panels, the floor above it, and the roof above that completely destroyed. So for the first few days after the fire, we basically had the sunlight directly outside the front door of the herbarium. And then within the herbarium itself, in this bottom picture, we also had some minor damage to the ceiling, which water dripped through. But fortunately, most of this water dripped onto the top of the wooden cabinets and didn't get inside the cabinets to damage the specimens. And then one of the other major problems was that we obviously then had no HVAC for several days after the fire, no air conditioning and humidity control until the emergency electricity could be restored. So this was restored about 4 days afterwards, but because it was in summer and it was quite hot, this elevated temperature and this evaporation of the water inside the herbarium resulted in a rapid increase in the humidity. And we're now also facing a bit of a mold problem, mold growing on parts of the walls in the herbarium. And within the last few weeks, we discovered a problem with an outbreak of these small beetles, which we'd never seen before. And Cornelia sent a photo, Cornelia, the curator, she sent a photo to an entomologist colleague of hers, I think at the Smithsonian, who identified it as this Cartidia constrictor, which supposedly is a mold-eating beetle and is often an indicator of moldy conditions. So it's quite likely that this mold problem and this outbreak of these beetles is related. But I'm sure there's probably a few entomologists in the audience, so if anybody can confirm or refute that identification, that would also be appreciated. Okay, and then just a brief outline of the post-fire responses. So the first thing that had to happen the day following the fire was that the engineers had to assess the structural integrity of the building before any staff members could go inside. And then that was done the following day, and certain people were allowed access into the building, including Cornelia and some principal technicians. And when they went into the herbarium, the morning of the day following the fire, they discovered that it had been flooded. And that was when they undertook the emergency rescue operation for all of the specimens stored in boxes on the floor, as well as the 2 Loma shelves of specimens stored in wooden cabinets. And then we had to get a contractor to come in to dry and dehumidify with these, dehumidify the herbarium with these industrial water hoovers. And then within the first few days following the fire, emergency electrical power had to be restored to parts of the building for certain facilities, especially for freezers used for DNH storage. And then after about 4 days, the air conditioning was restored. Yeah. And then this roof above the icy wild that was destroyed was obviously a risk of further flooding. So it was quite important that this was covered. So within the first week, a temporary plastic cover was put over this. And then after about a month, a more solid temporary roof of wood and metal sheeting was constructed. But then even after this temporary roof had been constructed, we found that even months later, when it rained heavily, or if the wind was blowing it in an unusual direction while it was raining, leaks would spring in random places of the building. So we had to be vigilant for additional flooding and continuously monitor leaks within the building, as well as fluctuations in the temperature and humidity. And then in terms of long-term damage, there's quite extensive damage to the floor and the ceiling, but especially the floor, because it's most of the floor of the herbarium is these wood planks, many of which have warped and some of which have started to rot. And there's also the mold problem. And then in the long term, the icy wild and the PCU will have to be redesigned and rebuilt. And then possibly one of the only positive things that came out of this whole situation was that we got a lot of publicity, a lot of offers for volunteer assistance, mostly to the library, but also a lot to the herbarium, and also eventually some donations, including a possible donation coming from the Hasso Plattner Foundation. So in terms of what we actually learned from this experience, the first thing is to store specimens properly and don't store them at the floor level, and that wooden cabinets can soak up water. We also have considered now getting metal plinths. We can't replace all the wooden cabinets, but at least if these are elevated on metal plinths like the metal cupboards are, if something like this happens again, the water, it wouldn't be such a problem. But obviously, ideally, metal cabinets are ideal for storage of herbarium specimens. And then we also learned that one disaster can have cascading effects leading. So this issue with the mold and the possible mold-eating beetles was not something that you would really anticipate as an outcome of a fire. So that was quite unexpected. And then one of the most important things is that the emergency personnel won't necessarily understand the value of and the risks to the collection. So guidance from knowledgeable staff members, both during the fire and also in the events following it, is quite crucial for mitigating further damage. So if Cornelia and Darwood, the principal technician who came in the following day, hadn't been permitted access to the building that following morning, and if the collection had been allowed to soak in that water for another day or two, probably the damage definitely would have been much more extensive. Probably hundreds or even thousands of specimens would have been damaged. And even on the day of the fire, the HOD, Tony Verboom, was there outside the building, and he tried to give guidance or direction to the firefighters, just to emphasize the irreplaceability of the bolus herbarium and the library, and the importance of trying to get them to contain a fire, to not in such a way that they didn't spread to those collections. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was just the importance of having like a proper inventory of dangerous chemicals within the building. So knowing what dangerous chemicals are stored and where, and how they should be handled. And especially if there are any explosive risks, because ultimately this could have implications for the emergency response. So there were quite a lot of chemicals stored within the plant conservation unit. And I think on the day of the fire, before the firefighting team entered the building, I understand that they struggled to get hold of the person that was responsible for these chemicals. And if they hadn't been able to, they actually didn't want to go into the building. So this could have actually prevented the firefighting team from entering the building to contain a fire within parts of the building. They would have just had to try their best to contain it from outside. And if that had happened, almost certainly the burners of Herbarium and the library would have been destroyed. So yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Dean, for that. I think, yeah, it has a very big message. So thank you for all those pictures and the insights. And now we move on to Christina Curry, the Blues Herbarium. So I don't think they've had a disaster yet, but they seem to be well prepared. So we'll hear about that. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please, Chanel? Or can I operate? Thank you. Okay, I realize now this is a presentation that I offered to Michelle because I did a presentation in 2019 at the UKZN Special Collections conference on the Pietermaritzburg campus, where the theme was risk management. So I decided to introduce the special collections at UKZN, which is mostly library based, to our herbarium, and then also introduced some of our the risks that we have, because it's very similar to what the libraries on our campus have. And looking at my presentation now, I realize that the one that was loaded is the original presentation and not the adjusted one that I sent, but that's okay. So I'm just going to skip through the first few parts then, and I'm going to this is just a bit of background for non-herbarium people. So our collection moved in 1984 from our main campus, from a wooden cupboard-based collection, to a new building that was considered quite modern in 1984, and it was specifically, one of the rooms in the building was specifically designed for the herbarium, and our previous curator, Olive Hilliard, was involved in this planning. So we were fortunate to get an air-conditioned building, which we had not had before, and it's currently air-conditioned to about 20 degrees C, sometimes colder, currently a bit colder, we're lucky. And the specimens moved from wooden cupboards to metal cupboards in this case, and it has magnetic seals and gaskets, so it's pretty well protected. A specific poisoning area was designed with a fume hood, and in the past they used to soak the specimens in a mercuric chloride containing solution, which is a practice we stopped about 25 years ago. We also used to pop mothballs in the cupboards, and that's also a practice that's been stopped for about 25 years because none of these are good for humans. And then we also used to fumigate with methyl bromide annually, but we only did that once in 2010, and now that practice has been phased out. So what I was trying to show these librarians is that we have very similar problems to what they have. And the reason I'm presenting this here is because it gives you an idea of the kind of problems that we have and how we can actually change practices over time. Today, in fact, I've changed that now. In the recent history, we fumigated with pyrethroids twice a year using Doom Fogger or similar commercial fumigants. We were freezing our incoming material to about minus 20 degrees for 3 days, and then we would repeat that. But currently, what we do is we don't fumigate with pyrethroids twice a year anymore. We now have a look and see approach because we've been part of the NSF. We're trying to change over to integrated pest management. So we are actually only going to fumigate when we really have to, when we have evidence that we need to. We freeze our incoming material now at about minus 30 degrees Celsius, and we actually repeat that after 1 week. That's the advice that entomologists have given us. So you take your specimens out, you put it back in. And we do visual monitoring and spot treating when we do have insect attack, and we're very strict on what enters our facility. Everything gets frozen that comes in. But what I'm also doing now is I'm trialing some insect traps that we've been chatting about in the collections management committee, and to see if which ones actually work well in a herbarium, because a herbarium has different challenges to, say, what a museum collection has. So how we manage our collection has actually changed quite significantly in the past 2 to 3 years because of the interaction we've had with the NSCF, and I think that's a good thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I wanted to really present for you guys is the challenges of being in a multi-user building and how that will actually affect your disaster response planning. We're based in the central of 3 of the John Bewes blocks on the Maritzburg campus. We're in the B block, but there's 4 levels to it. So basically, if you're ever going to design a museum or herbarium from scratch, don't do this. Okay, so on the 3rd floor at the top, we've got a library, the Life Sciences Library, and a set of ablutions and some offices. So immediately from the library, there's problems. They fumigate with different fumigants to us. They get different pests that visit them. They have students coming and going, and the ablutions are not great either. And then on the 2nd floor, that's us, the herbarium, but we also have a pollination ecology lab, we have offices, we have a scullery where people make tea and coffee, and an air conditioning plant. Then below us, we have a zoology museum, mostly a teaching museum, which I know Rendani has told you guys about before. We have offices, we have a grassland science ecology lab where students actually dry plant material in an oven from time to time and leave dried plant material out. We have a LAN room, those are computer rooms for students, and we have ablutions. And on the ground level, we have lecture theatres, a servery that sometimes serves food, an electron microscopy unit that has its own needs and challenges, and a set of ablutions. And you'll notice on the 2nd floor, the ablutions are missing, basically because my office is pretty much where the ablutions would normally be. But keep in mind that the pipes going up and down are still running through the back of my office. So in one building, we have a lot. And within that, we have to function as a herbarium and we have to keep ourselves safe. So how have we actually survived all these years? Next slide, please. Okay, so our environmental conditions are pretty good. We have central air conditioning, which normally is not ideal, but we at least operate on our own circuit and we have our own controls. So we have some autonomy in the temperature that we manage, and it also helps us to regulate humidity. But what it does mean is that if the central plant breaks down, we all break down. Okay. We also have a shared fire alarm and shared fire detection, and it's good when it's working. And currently, I'm very grateful that it is working, but about 5 years ago, I was permanently stressed because it was not working properly, and I spent my whole life reminding people about that. So, but we're lucky. We have good smoke detectors and the like, and in some ways, being in a big building helps us to actually have a better system. The windows in the herbarium are permanently closed, but I know for a fact that students in labs do sometimes open them, so that is a challenge, especially with insects coming in. We have external doors that we close, but students often leave things ajar. They also like to leave internal fire doors ajar, so we have to permanently remind people about that as well. And then those famous ablutions. At the time that I prepared this talk initially in 2019, there was actually water coming in from the floor above me. And what do you know, currently I have a drip on my desk again. So what happens is that because this building is now 35 years old, the roof is starting to leak in places. And even though they tried to fix it a few years ago, water still finds its way into those expansion joints that we heard about earlier in the National Herbarium. So that, coupled with the fact that we've got ablution pipes also moving up and down in the building, it means that we have to be constantly vigilant about this. But I've been assured that this will be fixed soon. Next slide, please. Pest control is a problem that we all face. For us, the main threats are beetles and book lice. So I've gathered that some of the herbaria in the center of the country don't have much of a problem with book lice, but us closer to the coast, we certainly do. And that very extreme example of eaten specimens, it's actually from the medicinal collection that came from Howard College via the Ward Herbarium. And I just had to take a picture of it just to show the extreme damage that insects can do. So around pest control, we have to be careful, and we have to actually start having good relationships with our neighbors. Having an ecology lab on the same floor is not ideal because students have dried, untreated plant specimens. They have their insect collections in their offices, and they often like to keep flowers for weeks and months so that they can count the fruit afterwards, which means you've got dried material sitting around, and that attracts beetles. Having a scullery with food is also not ideal. Next slide, please. So what are some of the solutions? Okay. So I'd actually, in my new presentation, split this in two. One, we can have physical solutions, things like temporary storage in sealed plastic bags. When we've got specimens that we know are going to sit around for a while, a researcher that says, I'll come and look at it again, but not now. We have some of our old wooden cupboards in a storeroom, and because it's wooden cupboards that don't seal that well, we actually seal every package in plastic and date it, etc. It makes it easy for us to take it out and freeze it if we need to for pest control. And it also means that if there is some kind of an insect attack in one package, it will hopefully stay in that package. And I think that will help to solve some of the problems that people have when you have temporary specimens sitting around, because they are vulnerable both to water damage and to insect attack. Things like having your collection cupboards on platforms for minor floods is important, as Dean told us now. You know, there's lots we can do to minimize risk, and I think that's how we have managed for so many years to not have any big disasters. Things like having your type folders with, you know, indicated with red, because our types are throughout the collection, not just in special cupboards. That's quite important, so that maybe during a fire we won't come running in to pull out the type folders, but if there was a flood where we could still come in and rescue things, then at least we know where to rescue these. So there's a lot of physical things we can do, and I know the collections manual has a lot of information on that. But what I really wanted to focus on is that the thing that we never speak about is our relationships. One of the solutions is to actually know the people on campus and know your neighbors. For example, these people in the ecology lab, in the pollination ecology lab, I know them well. I try from time to time to visit them for their lab meetings, just to remind them that they are in a shared building and that what they do in their rooms will affect us. So not to allow their specimens to sit around for too long, to actually bring it to me to freeze from time to time if they need it. I even freeze the insect collections for them from time to time, just because it helps them to control pests in their insect collections as well. And you have to, every year when there's a new crop of students, you have to have that talk again with everyone just to remind them and encourage them to rather bring their specimens to the herbarium and submit them properly sooner rather than later. And that will help a lot in general to stop both when their specimens come in, so that they're not already eaten, and also that beetles don't get attracted to the lab in general. Likewise with the library, which is above us. We chat to them. We often schedule our fumigations, when we used to fumigate regularly, on the same day so that we don't inconvenience the building twice in a row. And we do stay in touch with them so that we know what problems they have. The other people that you have to have very good relationships with is your risk management people on campus. They have to know what you're about. As Dean said, if your emergency personnel don't know that what you're doing is really important and that they have to prioritize your area in an emergency, they're not going to. So you have to get yourself on the health and safety committees and make sure that you're active there. You have to get yourself in touch with the people that run the building. For example, the floods the water that's coming through our roof a little bit at the moment, but luckily not into our main collection. We have to keep on top of it and constantly remind them, please, you know, it's a priority, you know, we can't leave it too long. And it's very frustrating because it's often out of our control. And that's the problem with a shared building, is that you have to constantly remind people about your needs and make sure that they take it seriously. And that's something we don't talk about, that sort of a thing really when it comes to our disaster mitigation, but to me it's a very important aspect of it. Okay, next slide please. And then one of the things that we worry about the most, of course, being a campus, especially after the Fees Must Fall protest in 2016, is our safety during a campus protest. So what we've done to try and help is we've actually installed a slam lock door in front of the herbarium foyer. We tried to install it far enough so that someone can't just throw a petrol bomb or something through the door if they do get in. There's also, you can see in the bottom left picture, that's another set of doors before our herbarium foyer that we can lock as well. So we used to just close the slam lock over long weekends or at night, but now we actually do it all the time, so we don't have people just walking in without sticking to COVID protocols. So it's been quite useful, actually. It gives us a sort of a safe space to work in. What the university has as a general policy is that when students want to protest through the building, they actually allow them access. So we often have the students actually coming up these stairways that you can see and then exiting the building again, which is quite nerve-wracking for us. But what we do is we switch off our foyer lights, we lock up, and we just hope that they don't see us. And then one of the most important things that we have is our herbarium and our building WhatsApp groups, so that we can monitor what's going on and warn everyone and say, listen, we're going to lock up now, just be careful, or so on, and that we can tell each other if we see any trouble on campus. And that's actually worked very well, and that boils down to communication again. So I'd say, even though it's not easy to put into your disaster plans, just keep in mind that you have to be part of your building, you have to be part of your community, and you have to constantly remind people that we need to keep safe. Okay, anyway, so I hope this was useful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christina. Sorry about the wrong presentation. So, yeah, so that's great. Thank you. I think there are lots of lessons that we can learn from all three of these presentations. Points, simple things that can be done. Okay, so let's just move on then. So thank you to the three presenters. We really do appreciate it. So I think at this point, if anybody's got questions specifically for Mashiani, Dean, or Christina, we can take those now while it's fresh in your mind. You can either put it into the chat or you can unmute and ask a question. We will have another chance right at the end of today's session. So let's just see. So I just wanted to ask Dean, so are you back in the herbarium, fully functional, operating, even though the place above you is demolished or basically destroyed?
So we were out for 2 months. That nobody really, except for certain emergency people, were allowed access to the building. And then since I think it was sometime in the middle of June, we got back into the building. So it's mostly operating as normal. It just looks like, it still feels a bit like a disaster or a site or a construction site. It doesn't look like it's back to normal, but the essentials are operating fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wondered about that. It must feel a bit like like a disaster.
Yeah, it's a bit bleak. And like even with the floors, like it didn't really cause that much, the soot and water that came down and went all over. It didn't really damage the floors throughout the building that much, but like it did stain everything. And for a long time, everything was just like stained gray and it smelled a bit like an ashtray. Yeah, so it was a bit bleak, but it's working, I guess.
Yeah. Very, very lucky to not have major impact. So thank you for that. All right, I think let's move on then. Thanks again. All right, can we move on, Chanel, to the next slide? So we've had some quite interesting different types of risks, emergencies, and disasters this morning. And just to, we often talk about fire, but there are other things. So this is our 10 agents of deterioration that we've spoken about. And just to look at them, so physical forces, so these can all be emergencies or disasters. So a building collapsing, a wall collapsing, a ceiling collapsing, shelving collapse, roof blowing off, those are all physical forces. So it can be quite a big scale thing if a building collapses, but it can also just be shelves holding the specimens can collapse. And then disassociation, something we don't often think about, is the server rooms. If you have a central server room, where your databases are hosted. If that's hacked or it crashes or it blows up, what would happen, especially if you don't have off-site database backups? That could be a disaster. And then pests. So yes, pests can be a gradual deterioration, but it could also be a major disaster. And pests can spread very quickly and destroy specimens very quickly. So if you had to open up a whole lot of cabinets and find that the specimens were infested, that could be considered a disaster. Water, flooding of collection storeroom, fire in the building. And we heard from Dean an interesting thing about how there can be a cascading effect. So there's a fire, but because of that fire, you have flooding, and because of the flooding, you have mold, and because of mold, you have a pest outbreak. So one disaster can trigger a whole lot of other disasters. And then what Christina mentioned is the possibility of vandalism or rioting, and something that I don't think many of our collections are targeted for robbery, but some may be, the paleontology. And it can just be robbery that has a cascading effect. So all of those can be emergencies or disasters. Incorrect relative humidity, incorrect temperature, light and UV pollutants. These are unlikely to be an urgent disaster and emergency, but I may be wrong there. But they're more likely to be gradual. So there's a whole range. We often talk about fire, but there are other things as well. Next slide. So we talked about this in the webinar last week, but just a reminder. So what is in an emergency or disaster response plan? So we said how critical it is to have this plan, because when there's an emergency or when there's a disaster, there's often not enough time to sit and think, or to start a whole procurement process, or to start educating people about what needs to be done to the collection. So you need a plan in place, because you have to react very, very quickly. So an emergency or disaster response plan should be there, and it should have the teams. So you should know you should have set up teams, and each person should have their role and responsibility very clearly documented, and they should know it. And then you need this decision-making and authorization and reporting lines, so that everybody knows who informs who authorizes what, because it may be different in an emergency compared to your normal processes. And you need to understand who's going to give the instructions. Otherwise, it can cause chaos. And then you need all the contact details of the staff in your teams, of your emergency services, of service providers and suppliers, and others you can assist. So if you need to have them at hand quickly, they should all be documented. And that should be updated regularly. Then you need an inventory of prioritized collections. So which are the most important ones, that if you had to get something out first, what would you go for? If you have to do salvage, what will you go for first? And you should show where they are, because it may not be you, it might be somebody else who has to go and retrieve them. And then something that Dean raised as well, and I realized I didn't put it in the webinar last week, but inventory of all hazardous materials in the building and where they are located. And that is really important, because you could be putting people's lives at risk if they go into the building to put out a fire or to deal with a flood, and they don't know that there's explosives or dangerous chemicals that could react with water. And so, yeah, it could have, if they hadn't been able to get that information at bolus, it could have resulted in the loss of the entire collection. But that's also part of the emergency plan or disaster plan. And then you need to have a list of all the materials and supplies for your emergency supply carts. And you have to identify backup storage and triage areas. So if you're going to move the collection out of a place to protect it or for salvage, where will you move it to? And then this is something that it's one line here, but there's actually a lot of information that would need to go into this. You need to know what are the processes for evacuation and your evacuation routes. And then you need to have your step plan actions for responding to different types of emergencies and for salvaging collection objects. And then you need a training schedule. So that would all be in your emergency and disaster response plan. Right, next slide. But what we said was that that is a lot of information. You have to have it, you have to do it, it must be there. But for reacting very quickly to make sure that everybody's got something either in their pocket, in their wallet, on their desk, quick and easy to access information is this pocket response plan. And so you're basically summarizing and taking the most critical points from your full plan and putting them on what's basically two sides of an A4 sheet. And so the first sheet would be all the contact information for everybody from your team, your institutional contacts, the building, the utilities people, your first responders, which is the fire department or the ambulance or a security company, and then your emergency recovery services. So like Dean said, they had to get somebody to come and industrial hoover and dry. So have those sort of contacts. You might need people who are specialists in paper recovery. So you can do that as well, have that. And then your regional contacts. So this may be that there's government structures for disaster reporting. And here they have a staff phone tree. And that is also something that's quite useful to think about. So you want to know that you'll have like a tree of who will contact and who will phone who, because everybody needs to know about it. And this could be a WhatsApp group rather. You might have a WhatsApp group rather. Okay, next slide. And then on the other side of your A4 sheet, this is your steps. So quickly, you can just look at your pocket response and you can see, what do I have to do right now, urgently today? Your immediate response, your assessment after a disaster, your communication. So it came up, communication is such an important thing before an emergency, but also after a disaster. And then the collection salvage. So what are the key steps that you should take? And then your collection priorities. And under other here, I think that we could put the list of hazardous chemicals or hazardous substances or materials that are there, even if it's just the most serious ones. And then your major disasters incident command system. So your authority structure, so who authorizes, and then the report. So this is also very important. So what they say is, you know, once there's been a disaster, everybody should know who's in charge, you know, who's the safety officer, what has, you know, what have you heard, what is the cause, what's happened. So all of that information should be available to the people who are on site. Otherwise, you get misinformation being spread.